everybody. Welcome back to our Zhang Zhung UK Light of Kailash lecture series. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Mark Aldenderfer tonight. And he's a professor emeritus at the University of California, 30 years researching Western Tibet and the Himalayas. So it's a pleasure to welcome such an expert tonight about the kingdom of Zhang Zhung, which is the name of our organization. So very nice to see that. And the talk will last about an hour, followed by some questions and answers. So if you have some questions, you're welcome to write them in the chat or just to keep them for Mark at the end of our talk. And thank you so much for being here with us tonight, and welcome everybody.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Zhang Zhung, for the invitation to speak with this group. I love talking about archaeology, and I love talking about Zhang Zhung. And so let me, I think what I'll do is I'll share my screen, and then I'll launch the PowerPoint. I don't know where all of you are right now. I welcome you to the lecture I'm about to give on Zhang Zhung. What does modern archaeology tell us about Zhang Zhung? And I think it's always important when I give lectures to various audiences that I give them a really clear idea about what it is I can do and what it is I can't do, and what it is I sort of know and what are the things I don't know. That could take a long time. But the important point of what I'm trying to get at is that I am not officially a Tibetologist. I have worked on the Tibetan plateau with sites that are known as Zhang Zhung era. I have now worked in the Himalayas. I do not read the languages. I don't speak them particularly either. And so this talk is going to be a mixture of archaeology. It is going to be a mixture of the addition of some textual knowledge that I've been able to glean from my colleagues who study this more intensely than I do. And so I want you to understand that, where I'm coming from on this lecture is very much the archaeologist. And so I will be mixing in as well anthropology, lots of archaeology, and then of course some speculations on what all of the archaeology and anthropology mean for understanding what we think Zhang Zhung may or may not be. So with that background in mind, then let me show you this image, and let me play it for you.
Zhang Zhung 里面的我也解了一面解，增加多西大蒙多大卫。Zhang Zhung 里面的罗平东神剧马线的，我解的面逻辑解，阿拉掐出去，所以下他们。我拿Zhang Zhung 里面去把，我真的浪费吧。Zhang Zhung 里面的这几浪费跟着我真的一样。Zhang Zhung 里面的神剧写的，这东真。
So what you've heard in that is the Champa talk show, which I believe this was recorded in 2017. And I will be clear, I don't take any position on any of the issues regarding Belt and Road or any of the other details on this. I simply wanted to show you this video because it's clear that there are many who believe that Zhang Zhung is in fact the originator, if you will, of Tibetan civilization. It has a variety of interesting political implications about that, but that's really not why we're here today. I'm really here to talk about whether or not there's any significant archaeological data that exists out there in the world that could be useful in helping us understand better what Zhang Zhung is, or what Zhang Zhung could have been, or what Zhang Zhung could mean for discussions of the kind that we're about to engage. So most of you know, if you've been, of course, many of you are members of the Zhang Zhung Institute or have studied Zhang Zhung in a variety of different contexts. You know that there are a variety of different textual sources that describe a polity out in Western Tibet that is variously called Yungdrung, Zhang Zhung, a variety of different ways to spell and organize that information. If you're a follower of Yungdrung Bon, you will know that this is these discussions about where Zhang Zhung was located, how old it is, who the founders were, what the lineages are. Those are things I won't be talking about. I will be talking, though, then about the archaeological evidence that we have that begins to give us some information about what some people think Zhang Zhung is. So looking at this image, you see this was published back in 2001. It's one of the very first publications by professional archaeologists who took a look at some mortuary sites in the area called Piang and Dongar. I'll be showing a number of maps during this discussion today, so you'll get a good idea of where it is that I'm talking about. So you'll see from this snippet of text is that they describe the cemeteries as very clearly from Shangshung by the 4th century. In this case, the Shangshung had been attacked. It's not entirely clear what the point of this abstract was, but I show you this just to let you know that archaeologists in China had begun thinking about this, more than 20 years ago, and began writing about it intensely then in the 21st century. So, as I said, I'm going to be approaching this as an archaeologist would. And so I'm going to then focus my attention on the following kinds of data that are crucial for understanding archaeological research and therefore interpretations of the past based on those kind of data. So we have in Western Tibet right now, we have a few residential sites that have been excavated. These are places where we are fairly certain that people actually lived within the confines or the boundaries of the sites themselves. We have a fair number of excavations at mortuary sites, that is, where people were buried in one form or another in, again, Western Tibet. They, of course, these imply the residential sites and the mortuary sites imply we have collections of artifacts of one kind or another that have been classified in various ways to indicate where they may have been from, the timeframes that they may have been used, and so on. So those two lines of evidence, plus, of course, the artifact record, provide us with a foundation to begin this conversation about Shangshung. The one thing, though, that is really missing from most of the work that has been conducted so far in Western Tibet on Shangshung, or for that matter, in many contexts of the archaeology of Western Tibet, is that final bullet point that I show you at the bottom, which is the systematic archaeological surveys to define settlement hierarchies. Now, this is archaeology talk, but it's absolutely critical and important archaeology talk in the context of understanding Shangshung in its detail. So let me show you an image that comes right out of one of my lectures that I used to give, archaeology, 101, that describes what a settlement hierarchy might in fact look like. So here's our hierarchy right here. And what it says is at the bottom, you have entities that these would be camps. And we're not trying to describe now a particular kind of society. We're not saying, oh, this is a chiefdom, this is a state, this is a kingdom. We're not really using those words right now. We will later in this conversation. So at the bottom, you have a camp. The next level up would be something like a hamlet, a concentration of small houses on the landscape. Then what you have is a set of villages on the landscape, that third bar in the middle. Above that is a town, and then above that is a city. And what a little image like that is supposed to be suggesting is that there are a variety of different kinds of functions that take place within each one of these levels of settlement. So in one sense, then you can say, well, a settlement hierarchy then examines the kinds of settlements we find in a region and the potential relationships between them. So obviously at the lower end of the spectrum, that is of the levels of settlement, there are many more hamlets and villages and camps than there are towns in most circumstances. There are relatively fewer cities, all things being equal. When you think about towns, they have a range of functions that might be administrative. They might have different kinds of economic activities. There may be local rulers of one kind or local elites that live in those as well. And then we think about the idea of the city. It's clear that these might be, we could call them, central places for a particular society. They may be the primary administrative capital of a place. There may be more than one of them. But the point I'm getting at here is that in order to place any kind of sites that we find in Western Tibet that may or may not relate to Shangshung, not only do we need the artifactual evidence from both mortuary and residential complexes, but we need some way to articulate them in some sense of how they might fit into a settlement hierarchy. So with that, then let me show you another image of what would be then implied by a social hierarchy. So here's an image that I took off the web that describes the social classes in Han China. And the reason I chose Han China is that has some overlap with what the dates, at least I think, Shangshung is likely to be in the archaeological record of Western Tibet. So Han dynasty dates from about 228 BCE to about, I don't know, 200 AD, give or take, maybe a little bit later on at that end. But I want you to look at what the social classes are as well. The bottom we have slaves. Then we have soldiers, artisans, peasants, officials of one kind or another, governors and kings, and finally emperors. Now, the reason I show this is that class hierarchies and settlement hierarchies often interact in a very interesting way. So that if you think about, for instance, hamlets or villages, the people who would primarily live in those would be peasants, perhaps a few artisans or merchants, perhaps slaves, perhaps soldiers. And as you begin to go up then the ranks in these things and begin to look then at nobles or scholars or state officials, you might then find them in towns of one kind across the landscape. And of course, at the very highest levels, that is of the larger cities in the Han dynasty across China, you would find the governors, the kings of smaller polities within that, and the emperors. So notice what the relationship then is between the settlement hierarchy and the social hierarchy. It ties these together to think about, okay, we have a place on the landscape. We can date it to a particular time frame. We can observe the kinds of activities that took place within that. And then on that basis, we can say, this would be a village within the settlement hierarchy of this region. And then we can do the same thing with any other kind of site in the region, as long as we have the data that are sufficient to do that. So what I'm going to do now is take you out to Western Tibet and give you an idea about the archaeological sites that I'd like to talk about for the rest of this lecture. To do that first, though, I want to make sure that everyone understands that we have a distinction between what is called Upper Shangshung and Lower Shangshung. You know, some people say there's a Middle Shangshung as well. My good colleague and friend John Beleza has done much of his career in Upper Shangshung. He's done some, of course, in Lower Shangshung as well. My focus is going to be primarily on Lower Shangshung. That is, the region I want to look at more intensely has the greater volume of archaeological excavations with securely dated archaeological sites that Chinese archaeologists have been working on for the past 20 or more years. So you'll notice the red boundary is just a boundary to give you an idea about ways in which some people have thought where the edges of Shangshung lie. I really don't have a good clue, quite frankly, about where that is. I just know that I think the idea of upper and lower in this context is actually quite useful. And I think that especially for lower, I think you'll see some interesting, there'll be some interesting parallels to other parts of the Shangshung, the Shangshung definition, but I think lower will give us the best ideas about what we can think of in terms of settlement hierarchies, social hierarchies, and then, some conclusions of one kind or another about what Shangshung may or may not be. So I need to move this right now, and I will do that, and then I will bring it back. So what you're looking at here is an image that I got out of Karl Ryevik's historical atlas of Tibet. And on the early part of the volume, he talks a lot about this idea of a Shangshung core. And if you look at the places on the landscape, you'll notice that there are 4 squares that are outlined in red in yellow. These are meant to be the grand castles of what some people have thought Shangshung polity looked like. Then you will see some smaller squares like Kyunglung, you will see Kakyor, Gyangri. Those are supposed to be what are called directional fortresses of one kind or another. And so what Carl is trying to portray here. And when you see the video of this, you can take a look at the key up in the upper left-hand side to give you an idea of what the sources of this are supposed to be. What he's basically saying is that as far as we know from the particular texts that he is describing at this moment, what you're looking at right now are in fact the primary places of Shangshung. Now, whether they're called castles in this particular context. The question we will be looking at then from an anthropological and archaeological perspective is, do any of these relate to some of the ideas of settlement hierarchies and social hierarchies that I was trying to describe before? So I make no brief that these are actually places that did in fact exist in Shangshung times. This is simply what late histories written by Bonpo scholars have described as being important places on the Shangshung landscape. I'll bring this other thing back up here now. And the reason I use this now is this is from Giuseppe Tucci's work, I think it's relatively recently published. And what he was trying to describe in this article was what he described from, again, different late texts written by Bonpo scholars of one kind or another about the putative lists of Shangshung kings. And so in this particular part of the text right here, you see that he lists then 8 different kings that had different castles spread across that landscape. I won't show you what the castles are in this because the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, from a textual perspective, looking at this, there is a suggestion, at least from these late texts, that there were a variety of different political divisions that Shangshung might have been carved up into, and that some of these are assigned to particular locations on that landscape. Again, I cannot evaluate this argument myself because I do not delve deeply into textual arguments of this kind, but I think what we'll find is that there will be relatively little at this point, and I say at this point, archaeological evidence that supports this kind of textual citation that he has laid out for us. Did I say this was Giuseppe Tucci? No, this is Roberto Vitali. My apologies. I don't know why I said that. But in any case, I'm going to actually now switch over to running this as a slideshow because I think that will mean there's better ways to show some of the images I'm about to offer you. So there we have that, and now let's move on. We've seen that already, so here we go. So now we're going out to Western Tibet, and the red squares tell us something about the places in which Chinese archaeologists and others have actually done most of the work that I'm going to be speaking of today that relates to Shangshung. So the box on the lower register is Gurgyam, Cardon, and the famous Silver Castle that was described by Giuseppe Tucci. And then the other box lists a larger number of sites that include Chuvthag, Kuta, Sangstar Lungmo, Dindun, Sasotang, Gelantang, Pyangdungar, Gebelusu, and Kaji. Now, I'm not going to talk about each one of these sites. That is, some of them are small and have relatively little to say about the archaeological record of this region, but all of these are now published in one form or another in primarily the Chinese language literature on the archaeology of this region. I'll also point one other thing out to you just because it's necessary for you to remember if you decide you want to really look at these things in greater detail, go back and look at the actual data themselves. The names really vary a great deal in terms of the way in which they get transliterated or translated into English. And so, for instance, I show you Chuvthag Kuta. Well, that Kuta was the first name of that particular mortuary complex in Western Tibet. It is now known by the name of Chuvthag. So, you kind of have to work through these things a little bit more carefully in order to really get a good sense of, am I talking about the same place or am I talking about someplace different? So, with that in mind, then, let's take ourselves out to Gurgyam, Khardong, and the Silver Castle. So here's a very nice map prepared by a recent PhD student, Samara de Broglia, just got a degree in France, working on the ceramics, primarily of Ladakh, but also then she made some comparisons of the ceramic materials in Western Tibet. And so this is a kind of an overview of where we will be. You will see that, Ngari province is fairly far, it composes a great deal of what Zhang may or may not have been, but we'll be down in that little illustrated red corner in the bottom part of that image. If you look to the right, then on the image, you see Gurgyam, which is where we'll be going first. And then later on during this conversation, we'll go next up to Pyangdungat area up in the top register. And then finally, we'll drop down to the Chuvag cemeteries that are very close to the Tanda Zara or the famous monastery of Toling. I show you this image right here because some of you may know this area if you've been out here. What it's showing you is that Gurgyam is the place where the very first clear indication of good archaeological data has been recovered for attribution to what might be the Shangshung polity. You'll notice an area called Temple. What that is the actual Bonpo monastery complex that resides in this area. And the cemetery then is literally right outside the gates of this place. I can't tell you in one sense how frustrating it has been for me, because I've been to Gurgyam a number of times at the same time that just before the Chinese found the cemetery, I walked over that terrain a number of times. I saw nothing. What it took was a truck driving over that terrain to actually find the first hints of the burial complex that sits below, right in front of the monastery domain. So before I go to that complex, though, I want to work on a problem that is often a translation problem as well as an identification or assignment problem that we find in this archaeology of Shangshung. And that is the idea of the so-called Silver Castle versus what might be considered Kyunglung Nulkar, which is also given the name Cardon. So what you're looking at here is an image of the region. And if, again, you've been out here, so you see Kyunglung village is over to the right. The idea that I think is Tucci's Silver Castle is pointing to an interesting geological feature that you will see momentarily from a different angle. And then up to the upper right-hand side, an arrow points to Khardong or Kyunglung Nulkar. So I know there's been a great deal of speculation about which one of these is really the one that Tucci found back in the day. And I'll simply make an argument that it's my belief that this is what I'm saying is Tucci's Silver Castle is in fact this geological feature, and that Khardong, Kyunglung Nulkar is something else entirely. I've been now to Tucci's Silver Castle a number of times, and this is what it looks like from the ground. And I've gone back and forth up and down this, rather badlandsy area that you see here. And there are Buddhist era remains. There are remains that are clearly of a religious nature. There are some habitations here at this site as well, but there is really nothing that I can definitively say belongs to what I would want to relate or will relate to a Shangshung polity occupation. So whatever this particular location was in the histories or the texts or the oral transmissions of this location, I honestly don't believe that this is really part of the Shangshung polity. That is, it certainly falls within a boundary that might be considered that, but I don't think it's an absolutely key site in that sense. And that's debatable, of course, for many, but I'll show you why I think that's the case in a moment then. So now where I'm taking you is someplace slightly different. I'm taking you now to what has been called Cardon. This is also known to archaeologists as well as textual studies people as Kyunglung Nulkar. And you'll notice that it has been attributed by some to be the capital of Shangshung. So what you're looking at here, it's a satellite picture of this particular location. I'll show you a ground level view in a moment. So if you can see my cursor floating around here, there's a very steep pathway up from the sides over here to the top. What you're looking at down here in this area is a residential area. You can see some very large pits of one sort or another. right here where my cursor is circling, you see this is a Bonpo shrine that's related to the Gurgyam monastery. And then up on top, where my cursor is moving right now, there is a set of other buildings that are quite separate from the others that you see down below, but I believe which are related to that structure as well. So let's take a deeper look then at what this site is actually supposed to look like. Before we go there, this is what Cardon looks like from the ground. It's, if you're in good shape, it takes about 20 minutes, 15 minutes to climb up to the top. The top of the site is around here, and it goes off into the distance. What you're looking at, I believe you're looking off to the east in this particular image. And you'll see then it's on this mesa, then it is quite difficult to get around and move into. So my Chinese colleague, Yongxiang Li, was the one who did the first mapping of the site, and this is what remains the standard for it. You can see then that this is a fairly complex site. The material in blue is primarily what would be called residential structures, some animal corrals, some clear water features of one kind or another, some buildings that are seen variously as public or perhaps ritual in nature. The dark area that you see floating around here is clearly a defensive wall. Now, I don't see that as being any question about it. It once surrounded the entire part of the site, as we see my cursor moving around the side like this. You'll see the size is, fairly substantial, almost 6 hectares in size. And keep that number in mind, though, because we're going to make some comparisons down the road. Up here are other residential structures that I do believe are associated with this, but form a different kind of occupation of the site. Just to the west, very close to the mesa that we've been looking at right now, is a very interesting set of residential structures that, as you can see, the grid patterns that are laid out here. The blue seem to be these residential structures. Some of the objects in green are platforms that have do ring. They're quite interesting in this complex. I've been over this as well a number of times in the past, and one thing that puzzles me very greatly is that when you walk the entire length of this complex, you do not see any residential debris. There's almost not a shred of ceramic. There's not a shred of bone. There's no shred of tools of any kind, stone tools. It's a very curious complex. It makes me wonder exactly what kind of relationship it may have had with the complex immediately to the east called Cardon. I do think they're related. We'll see what the radiocarbon dates look like now in just one moment. And here they are. So excavations on top of the mesa, Khardong itself, relatively limited. And so I'm showing you right now the most reliable radiocarbon dates we have from the site. And I'll simply drop you down to where my cursor is floating here. And the best dates for the complex as we see it on top dates from about 400 BCE to 650 CE. Is that a continuous occupation? Probably. I don't know if it waxed and waned during that time frame, but you can see now that it has a decent bracket from these radiocarbon dates. So this is fairly satisfactory then, I think, for thinking about what that place looked like then on the landscape. So keep all of the discussion I had in mind about what you saw there in terms of the kinds of buildings and structures and imputed functions. Now I'm going to take you to the cemetery at Gurgyam, the one that the truck drove over and collapsed its roof and then found. And the key here is looking very quickly at these are shaft tombs. You can see the shaft in the upper left-hand corner. These are dug down to level. They then are lined with stone, and then you can see the human remains down below there as well. You'll notice the dates then on this. It's 200 to 300 CE. Some of these cemeteries are not dated as well as I would like, but these are the dates that we have for them, so we work with what we have in archaeology. Here's another tomb that was found in the cemetery once they began to do more excavation. The same basic idea. Notice in this case, the shaft is coming down from the right. And if you look really closely to the image, what you find is There are a variety of artifacts in there, but there's also the complete skeleton of a horse, which I find is quite interesting. This is not the only horse burial in this region, but it's really it's a very interesting tomb complex from that regard. So the question then is, all right, well, what do we find then in this complex? So we find fairly interesting things, some copper vessels, as you see in the upper left. A really unique find for this region is that iron sword. We don't find iron swords anywhere else in this region. So clearly, this is a fairly important find. And then we've got this little gold mask down at the bottom. This is the first golden mask that was found in this region that now become famous for being identified for this time frame. Whether or not they're actually Shangshung is a different question, but now you will see in a few other images, other golden masks. Now, don't be fooled about the size. I'm sorry that there's not a scale bar on this image, but this is only about 4 centimeters in height. So it's a very tiny little golden mask, and it was found within one of the burial chambers of this context. But that's not all the really interesting things that came out of this. They found some absolutely fabulous silk. And so this is kind of a press release in kind of a statement about this. There's actually a long article that you can read about the discovery of this. This did in fact come from the Gurgyam cemetery. You'll notice that it says it's found near Kyunglung. It's found actually in the Gurgyam cemetery. And this is what they recovered from that. And so this has, it's a very beautiful Chinese silk. You can see the patterns on that have been, there are other patterns that have been found on other Chinese silks that match these as well. And then you can see the date range that clearly is from the 3rd, 4th century of this, the 3rd and 4th century of the Common Era, or AD in this particular case. So this is a pretty impressive find that was wrapped in some context within that cemetery. But that's not all. And this is one of the most interesting finds as well, is that there's actually evidence for real tea, what is being called connected by a Silk Road route at the Gurgyam cemetery as well. So you'll notice the quote down at the bottom. This comes from the article. It says, is located in the capital of the ancient Shangshung kingdom. Well, it's located at Cardon, and whether it's Shangshung, we can talk about later. And this image comes from their article. I just want to show you what they found as tea. So ignore the stuff on the right, because what that is actually a Han Dynasty tomb that did in fact have tea in it as well. The tea we find at the site of Gurgyam is on the left-hand side, and it has been chemically analyzed and taken apart, and it really is tea. And this, again, is the first discovery of this particular kind of substance found anywhere on this part of the Tibetan Plateau, or even for that matter, in the eastern part or the central part of the Tibetan Plateau. So again, it's a unique find. And it's interesting, though, that it is here, beside what is reputed by many to be at least a principal place of the Shangshung polity. So clearly, objects of importance have been brought here. But as we'll see, there are more important and more interesting artifacts found at other sites. Now let's head up to the Piang Dungat area, up in the upper left-hand side. And you can see up there, we've got Gelingtang, Donga, Piang, Area 5, which I won't talk about in this case. I will talk about Dindun and Sasotang. I want to show you this Dindun village, is a residential complex, because it's important to realize that we do in fact have some of these on the landscape. There are others as well that I would like to talk about, but since they've not been excavated, I can't tell you how old they are, so therefore it becomes a bit problematic for me to say, well, this is a Shangshung village. I don't know if this is Shangshung, but it fits in the time frame. The area outlined in red is what I believe the extent of the actual village complex was. You'll see my cursor floating here on the right. These are much later Buddhist era constructions of Chortens around here. The main concentration of the village is right here, and we have a good radiocarbon date of 350 BCE to early part of the second century AD CE, which overlaps very nicely with the dating that we have from Cardon. The village itself, it doesn't recommend itself much to look at. But what's important to understand about what you see with these piles of rock is that these piles of rock were once walls of many structures here, most likely circular, possibly rectangular, hard to tell given the scatter. But this is what I think many of the village components related to what might be Shangshung look like across the Western Tibetan region. So we happened to be able to excavate one of them back in the late 90s, and that gave us the radiocarbon date that you heard me describe a moment ago. Artifacts from here were typical of what you find in a house. We excavated hearth, there's some sheep bones in there, some botanical remains, really nothing really much to describe other than simple family life of village-based agriculturalists. Now we go to two of the cemeteries we have found up in this region as well. And what you will see is these cemeteries are quite distinctive when you think about Gurgyam for a moment. Those were shaft tombs, okay? And so they were dug deeply into the ground, and they were filled with, they were lined with rock in many cases and filled with material, and then covered over. These are quite different then. So the Gelingtang ones are the ones that you see that are outside the small box on the right. And if you take a look at the profile of M6, what you find is it's a ramp that comes down from the ground surface. A chamber is excavated within that, and then the remains of people are found in there as well as a horse, in this case, that is similar then to the horse burial that we saw at Gurgyam. Notice the date, though, which becomes interesting. This set of cemeteries, that is Gelingtang, is much earlier than the one we found at Gurgyam, which suggests a relatively early occupation of this particular location. And now we have to ask ourselves, or can ask the question, does this relate to the dates that we have of Shangshung from Khardong or from Dindun? They do overlap at the end of the dating, that 137 BCE, but is that enough to really say they're Shangshung? Sasutang is a very large cemetery in this vicinity as well that has a very early date, although this one comes closer to the dates we found at Cardon. And you notice these are simply they're basically rectangles that are placed in the dirt. They're very shallow. The human remains found in them are very sparse. They're disarticulated. They're kind of a mess, in fact. Almost nothing buried within them. I would argue cemeteries like this one, like some of the ones that you see up at the top with M1, M3, M10, these are the burials of relatively simple folk that lived around these sites at this time. M6 is a little more complicated because it does have that horse. But my point is that look at the variability now in the burial treatments that we see at these two different sites. It's telling us something about time and also possibly cultural relationships that may or may not fit into a good reconstruction of what Shangshung might have been like. Now I'm going to take you down to Chuta or Chuvthag in this case. And what we have again are these are shaft tomb burials as well. And so you can see the way in which the Chinese have excavated this out. They've dug them down deep, and these are the ways in which the shafts were then articulated once from the ground surface, and then one descends into this context. You'll notice the dates then are 400 BCE to 50 BCE. They overlap with the earlier dates from Khardong. They overlap to some extent with the dates I just showed you from up in Gelingtang or Pyongyang. So again, we've got these mixtures of things. They overlap. They don't really overlap at all, though, do they, with the Gurgyam cemetery that I described to you earlier. So it complicates the picture very much. But this is the kind of things that were found there, and this is why it gets fascinating again. So you'll see then, as you're looking down into the shaft tomb from the upper left-hand corner of the image, And what you find when you get down to the bottom of this tomb is something quite fascinating. There's a wooden coffin in this context. I'll show you a few more images in a moment. The white that you see comes from salt deposits. That is, water has seeped into this complex over the centuries and leaves this white residue behind. You'll notice the ceramics are recovered from the site. You'll notice a variety of iron objects over here, wooden objects down here, iron shafted, wooden shafted arrows as well. So the complex is really interesting with the addition then of these these coffins, wooden coffins. Here's another view of the same context. You see then that there are a number of other wooden coffins within these tombs. You'll notice the niches that have objects in them as well. You've got some fairly decent ceramics, some more wooden objects as well, some tray tables, a necklace, nice stuff, mostly stone. And down you see in the bottom right-hand side, what is clearly a G bead from these tombs as well. You'll notice there's a lot of material here, but it's not particularly, what would be the right word? It's not particularly fancy. And I'll explain what I mean by the idea of fancy in a moment. And we do in fact find in Chufthag 2 different gold masks, and these become interesting as well. The one on the right is very small, very much like the Gurgyam mask that I showed you earlier. The one on the left, though, is quite fascinating. It's about 15 centimeters in size from the chin to the top of the turban. It's a gold-silver composite. That is, the exterior is made with a very fine layer of gold, very thinly beaten gold, and backed with silver. And if you take a look at the turban, that is, if you have a moment when the video comes along and you would like to see this again, it has a series of matched images of animals and some birds on it that are, quite clearly distinctive as motifs of this area. But this then becomes one of the most important sets of objects that I would suggest to you are potential, I'll use the word potential wealth objects in this context, but I won't push that too far at the moment. Finally, I'm going to take you to this cemetery that is also outside of Toling near Zada. It's Sangma Lunga. You'll notice the dates, 360 to BCE to almost the 8th century CE. So you're looking at the valley of the Sutlej right here, and the archaeological site is off to the off to the right. You'll see my cursor floating around over here where the archaeological site was found. The Toling is on this drainage, of course, as you know. Again, descending into a shaft tomb found, by the efforts of the archaeologists. And what you find then in the context is very similar to what you found at Chufthag. That should be no big surprise, given the fact that the radiocarbon dates overlap a great deal. You'll notice that this particular coffin complex is filled with basketry of one kind or another. So these must, we're waiting for many of the analyses of the contents of these baskets to be revealed to us, but I would guess that the variety are containing some kind of food stuff that was placed in the tomb with the dead individual. And believe me, there are people under here. It's just that the archaeologists had to be extremely careful in the excavation because of the accumulated material that was placed on top, as well as the salt deposits and the decomposition of material found in the tomb itself. But there's some really unique objects then, well, really unique. There are unique objects that come from this. 3 wooden figures. These are not known from any place else on the Tibetan plateau, only from this region of the West. Bronze mirrors, that is the object on the right. There have been others found in central Tibet. So this is not especially different, but it does show that it is an object that is not likely to have locally been made. You'll notice the same sets of the ceramic vessels as well as the basketry and the wood and all that. But I direct your attention to the lower right-hand side of the image, and you'll see a really lovely gold, I guess I would call that a pectoral, which would be hung around someone's neck from the 2 points that you see on either side of it, and appears to have been accompanied by those agate beads. So this is actually a fairly substantial piece of gold that was found within this tomb context, or one of the tomb contexts that was excavated by the Chinese. And then take a look at a few more of the interesting objects that come out of there. The ceramics we've seen. Notice the silver and gold mask at the top. Well, there are two different ones in this case. Notice they're almost identical. Again, they're very small though. There's nothing quite like that 15 centimeter sized mask that came out of one of the other Chukdog tombs. But again, they're a composite of gold and silver with faces painted on them. There's a lovely series of gold pendants that you see in the center of this image as well. Another very small gold face, that is a very tiny one in the context, and then some beads, glass beads. And it would be really very lovely to know where these glass beads are from, because we've done some work where I work in Upper Mustang, have found that, these glass beads range from origins across time from Sassania, possibly even as far west as Egypt, as far south as the Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka. So it would be really interesting to know where the provenience of these beads actually is. But you'll notice then that this is a somewhat richer tomb in the context of the cemeteries we've looked at so far. Finally, there's a really interesting object here that I've still tried to puzzle about. I would love to see a better image of this from a publication, but right now that has not taken place. So the arrow on the left-hand side pointing inward is pointing to what is a silver mask. This is not a golden mask, it's a silver mask, and its shape is very much different than the ones that you have seen in this conversation earlier today. And the upper red arrow then is pointing to a skull of a person that obviously wore the mask. Now, this is quite different in the composition of it and the image that one sees of these masks. The other images look like real people, at least in some kind of figurative sense. This one is strange, and I would love to know more about it, but at this point, I can't say much. So let me try to summarize what I've been talking about today, because I think it's important now to take the artifacts, the sites, the context that I've described, the dates as well, and try to work this together in terms of some sense of the social as well as settlement hierarchy that I described earlier in this conversation. So what do we have and not have? Well, I would say we have some wealth. Now, when I say wealth, what I mean by that is that there are some people in this landscape at different points, as indicated by the burial context that I've shown you, that have had the ability to have objects of wealth, gold in particular, but also silver and other kinds of artifacts buried with them. For what purpose? I can't say honestly, but their mere presence indicates some kind of accumulation of wealth. All right. How much wealth becomes an interesting question then to discuss. I should also point out that gold is very common in Western Tibet. That is, some of the most important gold mines that once the central Tibetan polities began to exploit, much of the gold came from the West. Some of the gold also then comes probably, although it's not clear, from someplace in Central Asia. We just don't know about that provenience right now. Now, I show you this image of peas because it's important to keep this idea of wealth under control. So green peas, you can see a sense of the size of these green peas. They're just little things. You've all eaten them, I hope. And here's the point of showing you peas. This is a golden mask that I found in Upper Mustang that dates to about 450 CE. It's about the same, it's 15 centimeters. You can get a good sense of the scale in this particular image. Got a nice painted face on there. But the reason I show you the peas and then show you the mask is that the technical analysts that helped me understand the origins and the fabrication of this mask told me you did not need a piece of gold any larger than a very large pea to form this very large mask. So that tells you a little bit about the wealth, if you will, of these sites. That is, the gold is present, but you don't need to have very much of it to make most of the golden artifacts that I've shown you today. Those two exceptions come out of the Sangmo-Lungdo context that had that very lovely golden pendant, as well as that pectoral that I showed you. So keep in mind then that wealth right now is quite relative in terms of the accumulation of this material. Well, let's do a little comparison then. If you want to talk about true wealth, let's take ourselves now to relatively contemporary Han China, Han Dynasty China. And what you're looking at here, this is a suit made of jade, little, rectangles of jade. There's a person inside there. It's from it's a tomb of a noble, but a relatively, he's a noble, but he's not really of the very highest upper classes. So begin to think about then the accumulation of wealth it takes to get the jade going in this context. And then think about the fact that it was all sewn together with gold thread. So it had a textile base, and then gold wire was wrapped around the textile to put all of this together. Here's another one of these individuals, another, important person, but nobody that was really absolutely special at the top of a social hierarchy in Han Dynasty China. The same kind of idea. Lots of nice jade accompanying the dead. The gold then is simply used to sew all of this together. Now, from my perspective, this is now when we're beginning to talk really about wealth and the accumulation of objects that are clearly exotic and brought into a mortuary context to signal the importance of the dead, and as well the importance of the family, or the context of the social life of that person when he was living or she was living. Okay, do we have a large town, or do we have a center of political activity in what I have shown you so far? And let me stress again, this is what we know right now from the archaeological record. This is not much speculation on my part about, could there be more? Sure, but this is what we've got. So if you come back then to Cardon, excuse me, you'll notice then there it is. Got a defensive wall, got some public buildings, got some residential places. There's, animal pens and all that interspersed with all of that. Well, let's look at contemporary Han China. This is slightly later. What you're looking at then is the important site of Chang'an, Xi'an in today's parlance, during the Sui and Tang dynasties. This is actually the city that the Tibetan Empire conquered fairly early on in its entity. Notice what the scale is. There's a scale bar down at the bottom there. It's a 2 kilometer scale bar. This is a very complex site with a very large number of activities taking place within it, with a very large number of people that live there as well. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not trying to make what I would call an odious comparison here, but it is important to give us a sense of scale differences between places that we know are absolutely, truly complex, like this site, as opposed to what we have out in Western Tibet right now. And finally, do we have a settlement hierarchy? Recall that we wanted to make sure, we wanted to understand if there were variations in sizes and functions of the sites that we find in the region. And this is what I think we have. So back to the image again, you'll notice then that Kyunglung Nulkar is one of the important castles. Kyunglung, I'm not entirely sure what is actually meant in this, other than being what's called a directional fortress. But so we have one place on the landscape, as you see there, that appears to be, something that was documented by, at least in these texts, by Bonpo scholars as being one of the important places on the landscape for what was then thought to be, or is thought to be, Shangshun. But this is what I think we need to keep in mind then when we begin to look at the data as I've laid it out for you today. And sorry for the anthropology at this point, but I want to show you this because this is one way to look at a combined social as well as a settlement hierarchy. So at the top, you see what would be called a state level of social and hierarchical organization. There's one big central polity. They've got a number of subsidiary polities below that, and below them, they would then have towns, villages, and hamlets. As you get to the bottom, if you go all the way down to the bottom, what you see is what would be called a tribe. That is a relatively similar autonomous places on the landscape that would look pretty much the same across that landscape in terms of their ability to obtain wealth and then begin to differentiate themselves one from the other. What I'm thinking at the moment is that what I have shown today in terms of the settlement hierarchy and the social hierarchy of what could be called Xiongshung then is going to fit someplace in between this idea of complex and simple chiefdom. Now, the data are really limited, as you see, but I think I can't show you anything that is truly, a very large accumulation of wealth out there. I can't show you right now a very large population in this region right now, but I give you some hints then about what that might be. It is not a tribal level society that I have shown you, but it is not obviously a state. That is a very complex social and political entity. So it fits in the middle someplace like a Goldilocks. It's just right somewhere in that context. So finally, I have to ask this question then, well, is all of this Xiongshung or is it not? It would be lovely if the archaeological record had things like this, that had a little sign there, but in whatever language was being, well, the Xiongshung language was being spoken, certainly then, whether it was written entirely is unclear to me, certainly. There's no sign out there that tells me any of what I have looked at is Xiongshung. So I really don't know if this is Xiongshung, but I will say this, that there is clearly a complex polity in Western Tibet. It falls within the time range that we know is likely, well, has been described by the Central Tibetan texts, Dunhuang manuscripts, as well as the Old Tibetan annals, things of this sort as being a place on the landscape that fit within the time frame of what was known to the Central Tibetans as Xiongshung. So I think there's a high probability that what I've talked about from these sites represents something that I think we can agree is likely to have been Xiongshung. But before we get too excited, we need much more evidence that comes from all of the different angles of archaeology to really begin to make attributions of this kind, as certain as they possibly can be. So with that, I will simply say thank you, and I've finished. So I won't list all the sponsors. I will simply say thank you for attending today. If you have questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them, given the constraints of the things that I actually know. So where should we go from here, Jianming? Do you want to take the screen over again?
Thank you so much, Mark. It's up to you, really. We can even leave it like this, I think, or maybe
Okay.
if you take off your let's see, share screen, maybe we'll see you bigger.
I'll stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, there we go. That's better.
Okay, so
Perfect.
So anyway, I always love talking about this because the more I look at the literature, I'm not as confused as I used to be, but I'm still not certain of many things.
That's the nature of learning, I suppose. So I wanted to ask you something, if nobody has any impelling question. You mentioned tea, the presence of tea. I was just wondering what the significance, if you could explain a bit more specifically of the tree group or what.
Tea is one of those substances that was, early on was actually part of the Chinese elites, in China itself. And so the fact that it's been transported across the Tibetan plateau all the way out to a very distant location means that somebody out there in Western Tibet is able to actually then create a context whereby they can actually get this material themselves. So this tells me that there's a set of individuals. I don't want to call them kings or chiefs or princes. I just know that they are living in this complex society that allows them then to accumulate this material that is also then clearly associated with Chinese elites in the eastern part of East Asia. So that's what I think the importance of tea is in this place. It just is one more indicator, in my opinion, of the complexity, the relatively simple complexity, if you will, of this region as we know it right now.
Got it. Thank you. If we have any questions, you can I think there's a way of raising your hand, but you can even just jump in, unmute yourselves, and ask. No problem.
Yeah, can I ask a question actually?
Sure, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the gold masks and stuff, because about the size of them, because in like in ancient like Mycenae they had like the gold death masks, but those weren't as small as these masks. So I was just wondering why they might be so small.
I love the question, and I'll tell you why, is because, there's only two really large gold masks found in this entire region right now. The one I found in Upper Mustang and the one that was found at Chufthai. Those are big. These masks have a very clear connection. I'm not sure I would go all the way back to Mycenaean times, like the Mask of Agamemnon, but I would connect these two. It's very clear that they're very similar to golden masks that one finds in Kyrgyzstan, one finds actually in Xinjiang as well, that are about the same size as large masks. Now, why are the small masks so small? I think it's because what I'm seeing here is that is because whoever the individuals that were buried with those little tiny gold masks, honestly, that's probably the best they could do in terms of their access to wealth and their access to, these what would be called exotic materials or more exotic materials. Perhaps there's a different explanation, but right now I'd prefer to stick with the economic one because, as I said, gold was ubiquitous out there, but not everybody obviously had it in their burial contexts. And so I think small and large actually make a difference in terms of access and relative degree of wealth in these contexts.
Brilliant, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, thank you very much for the beautiful presentation. So my question is, is there any study that's been done in Ladakh regarding Zhang Zhung?
Good question. And the answer is, to my knowledge, not in Ladakh. That is, I have a very good colleague, Lodian Bruno, who works in Ladakh and worked there extensively over the years. And we've talked a lot about Zhang Zhung and whether or not anyone sees anything like what I've described right now. Now, keep in mind, another limitation of what I'm about to say to you is that the excavated archaeological record of Ladakh is not particularly great. That is, there isn't much of it out there to do a lot of comparisons. So we don't see right now, she and I have talked, we don't see anything that quite looks like the material that I described to you. However, there is one site in northwestern Himalayas. I believe it's in Uttarakhand. It is from an archaeological site called Malari. And it dates to about the same time frame that we're looking at with Zhang Zhung. It's a golden mask that is one of the larger ones as well. And you can see that in some of the Chinese publications where they've made comparisons. Now, the other context of that burial is wholly different than what I've described to you today. That is, the only point of similarity between that northwestern Himalayan context and the rest of what could be Zhang Zhung is simply this golden mask. So right now, the answer is no, we don't have a good sense of anything that looks like Zhang Zhung going to the west from the archaeological record.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I've got another question.
Please.
You mentioned those like wooden figurines.
Yes.
What do you reckon those might have been for? Or
Oh, questions like this are great, and they're also really hard because, what happens when you begin to look at these things, when you begin to look at individual objects that are placed in mortuary contexts, the first thing that obviously comes to mind is, well, they must have some kind of religious signification. But, maybe it's an effigy of the person placed in the context. I really don't know. Is it religious? I really can't say, because once archaeologists start talking about religion, you better watch out, because then that's when they really kind of unsure about what they're talking about unless they have some really, really clear empirical warrants. So it could be either, it could be either of those or something completely that I haven't thought of. It is fascinating to find them though. And I'll tell you one thing that we did in fact find in a different burial context in, again, Upper Mustang. We have not similar effigy figures, but we have wooden stakes or wooden, I guess I'd call them stakes, that have clearly human images placed on them, again, in a mortuary context that were probably associated with individuals. That is, a stake is put in somewhere near the individual. It has a picture of a person on it, or a picture of some other kind of design on it as well. That is, reminds me of these wooden figures from Chubthag, or I'm sorry, from Sangsar Lumda. But do I know what they are? No, I'm sorry. I can't really say much more.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do we have any more questions? If we don't, then maybe I would like to ask you just one last thing. We saw some pretty grand objects of these funerary sites, and I'm wondering, for more simple common folk, are there any indications of what sort of objects were found in mortuary sites of more average people's tombs, let's say?
Yeah, I think that the mortuary record of the more humble people, if you remember the cemetery at Gelingtang, Sasotan, those were fairly simple complexes. Some of the squares are only about 1 meter on one side, and there was almost nothing buried with them. So the amount of material and the range of materials found with in some of those cemeteries indicates to me that these are the remains or a context of simple folk. As you begin to look at those shaft tombs, are they the simple folks that we're thinking about? I doubt it. I'll tell you why. I think they might be a rung or two up the social ladder. Honestly, I can't say that, but there's a lot more labor that goes into making a shaft tomb, in terms of the depth that it's dug, the context of putting the rocks around it, and then getting all of that stuff down in there as well. So, the best I can offer you again is a comparison between what we found in Upper Mustang. I'm not saying Upper Mustang is part of Shangshung, but again, it's shaft tombs, gold masks, wooden coffins, things like that. There is, one shaft tomb that has all of these fancy objects in it, the wooden coffin, the golden mask, everything else. And then there's 8 or 9 other shaft tombs that are associated with it around the same area that have very simple objects with them. Some iron arrowheads, a few scraps of textiles, a few ceramic fragments, things like that. Those to me are the more, these would be the more common, humble people, as opposed to someone else who has a higher level of social status. And so I think that many of those big cemetery complexes, especially around Piang Dungar, I think those are of fairly simple people, that is, commoners living in these areas. We haven't, and some of them, others will be more elite people, but haven't really found many of those yet.
Thank you. And
Okay.
would there be any evidence of sky burial at the time, or would it have been mostly burial per se?
That's we no sky burial yet. The problem is, you saw the condition of the human remains in some of those tombs there with the debris all over top of them, and the remains are really badly, they're badly preserved in this context. I've not seen any of the physical anthropology reports. I don't think they've been described in any detail. I will say, though, that when you take a look at, again, back to Upper Mustang, because we really have looked at the human remains there, we don't see sky burial, but we do in fact see defleshing of the dead. So in other words, a person dies, the flesh is stripped from their bones, the body then is placed in the tomb. I would love to know whether or not any of these, the humans in the sites that we've been describing right now have a similar treatment or not. So far, our context is unique in this part of the Himalayan world.
Thank you very much.
So can I make one more comment before, we go? So you're gonna, I think, hear John Beleza next time, right? John and I, we get along very well with many of the things we talk about. That I didn't talk much about the upper Shangshung because, it's his domain. That's where he spent most of his time. But I will say one thing from my perspective, it's very different in many respects than what I described to you today. So it doesn't mean it couldn't be part of a Shangshung polity, but I do think it's quite distinctive in terms of the nature of the settlement pattern, the kinds of adaptations people had, and so on. So I think it'll be a really nice contrast to what I talked about today. So I'll look forward to tuning into that one when you've got it scheduled.
Fantastic. Yes, indeed.
Professor,
Next
one
month.
more last one question, please. I'm so sorry. I might have missed it, but I just wanted to ask the silk that you shown, the silk and the tea. How old are those?
So the silk is it's from Gurgyam. So that puts it into about 200 AD, give or take 200 to 300 AD. The silk is in that same context. It's going to be between 200 and 400 AD. So it's from the same burial complex, Gurgyam, sorry. So they're about that age. So there's no tea older than that. And there's only scraps, not really any fabrics that I remember from many of these sites out west as well. So that's unique right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, Mark, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for attending. And as Mark mentioned, next month we'll have a talk with John Vincent Beleza about the fabled kingdom of Shangshung. So please do join us for that. And the calendar is up on our website, Shangshung UK. So thank you, Mark, very much. Thank you again.
You're welcome, Zhang Zhung, and thank you very much, all of you who came. And I wish you a good evening or day or whatever time zone you happen to be in. So thanks very much for coming.